The morning Martha Henley found the bloody fabric in the snow, she should have turned around and gone back inside her cabin, should have bolted the door, stoked her fire, and pretended she never saw that mangy dog pawing at something red beneath the old pine tree. But Martha had always been too curious for her own good. That's what the folks in Copper Creek said about her anyway. That peculiar widow woman, they called her. The one who talked to stray animals like they might actually understand. The fabric was torn from a child's dress, soaked through with blood that hadn't yet frozen solid in the February cold. Martha's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the pattern: small blue flowers on white cotton. Sarah Mills had worn that very dress to church just 3 days ago, before she took suddenly ill and couldn't be seen by anyone. The dog, scrawny thing with matted fur and intelligent eyes, refused the scraps of bacon Martha offered. Instead, he circled back toward the dark tree line, stopping every few steps to make sure she was following. His urgent whining cut through the winter silence like a knife. As Martha hesitated at the forest edge, the bitter wind carried what sounded like a woman's distant scream through the bare branches. But when she strained to listen, there was only the dog's insistent whimpering and the ominous creak of winter-dead wood. Martha pulled her woolen shawl tighter and stepped into the wilderness behind that determined dog. The snow crunched beneath her worn boots as she followed him past frozen creek beds and abandoned mining equipment, rusted remnants of her late husband's failed dreams, scattered like broken promises across the landscape. The dog led her deeper than she'd ventured in years, past territory that had once been familiar. These trails held memories of better times, when Thomas was alive, and they'd explore these woods together, back before the mining accident took him, and left her with nothing but an empty cabin and a town that whispered about her peculiar ways. "Easy, boy," Martha murmured, watching the dog's purposeful movement. This wasn't wandering. He knew exactly where he was going. "What is it you're trying to show me?" The dog paused at a fork in the trail, his ears pricked forward. 3 other abandoned cabins sat scattered through these woods, relics of the boom days when miners had hope and families had futures. But the dog bypassed them all, heading straight for the one place Martha hadn't thought about in years. Whiskey Pete's cabin sat in a clearing that hadn't seen sunlight in months. The old trapper had died 5 winters back, and the place had been empty ever since. At least, that's what everyone in town believed. But as Martha approached, something made her skin crawl. The door hung slightly ajar despite the harsh weather, and fresh footprints marked the snow around the entrance. Too many sets of boots for an abandoned place. The dog stopped dead at the threshold, hackles raised, staring into the dark interior. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not at Martha, but at whatever lay beyond that half-open door. "What's wrong, boy?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. That's when she noticed the other signs, wisps of smoke that had risen from the chimney recently, leaving gray stains against the winter sky. Someone had been here. Recently. The dog's behavior told her everything she needed to know. Whatever was inside that cabin, it was something that made even a brave animal afraid to enter. But it was also something important enough that he'd risk everything to bring her here. Martha stepped closer to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gap she could see nothing but darkness, but the air that drifted out carried scents that didn't belong in an abandoned cabin. Coffee grounds, leather, and something else she couldn't quite identify. As she reached for the door handle, the dog pressed against her legs, looking up with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. He'd brought her this far for a reason. But when Martha pushed the door open just another inch, a board creaked somewhere deep inside the cabin, echoing through rooms that were supposed to be empty. Martha's hand trembled as she pushed the cabin door fully open. The hinges protested with a long, rusty groan that seemed to announce her presence to whatever might be waiting inside. The interior was impossibly warm for a place that should have been abandoned. Fresh ashes glowed in the fireplace, and the air held heat that spoke of recent human occupation. Canned goods lined shelves that should have been bare, and a coffee pot sat on the stove as if someone had just finished breakfast. "Hello?" Martha called softly, then immediately regretted it. If someone was here legitimately, they would have answered already. The dog finally entered behind her, moving with the cautious steps of an animal that had learned to fear human spaces. He led her toward the back of the cabin, where Martha began to notice things that made her stomach turn. Women's belongings scattered the main room like discarded memories. Hairbrushes with long strands still tangled in the bristles. Torn petticoats hanging from crude hooks. A child's cloth doll lying face down on the floor, one arm missing and the other stained with something dark. Martha picked up the doll with shaking hands. She'd seen this before. Little Emma Wright had carried it everywhere before she ran off east 6 months ago, according to her family. But children didn't abandon their treasured dolls when they left home willingly. "Lord help us," Martha breathed, the pieces starting to fit together in her mind. The dog whined and scratched at what looked like a solid wall panel. But when Martha examined it closer, she found it was actually a false partition, cleverly constructed to hide whatever lay beyond. The hidden space behind the wall revealed the true horror of what this place had become. Makeshift beds lined the floor, each with rope restraints attached to the walls. The stench of fear and human misery hung in the air like a physical presence. But it was the personal belongings that broke Martha's heart. Letters, half-written and never sent. A silver hair ribbon she recognized as belonging to Rebecca Stone, and there, crumpled in a corner, a piece of paper with familiar handwriting. "My dearest family," the letter fragment began, "I am not where you think I am. If you receive this, know that I tried to—" The handwriting was Emma Wright's, clear as day. But this letter was dated 2 weeks after Emma had supposedly left Copper Creek for a better life in Denver. Martha's hands shook as she folded the letter carefully into her apron pocket. This was proof. Evidence that the missing girls hadn't left willingly, hadn't found better lives somewhere else. They'd been taken, held, and God only knew what had happened to them after that. The dog's sudden alertness made Martha freeze. His ears pricked forward, and his body went rigid with tension. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking across the floor above them. Martha hadn't realized there was an upstairs to this cabin. But someone was moving around up there right now, and those footsteps were heading toward what sounded like a stairway. She grabbed the dog and pulled him toward what she hoped was another exit. But as she searched frantically for a way out, she heard the unmistakable sound of men's voices drifting down from above. "Clean up this mess tomorrow night after we move the current batch. What about the one who's been sniffing around? The widow woman?" Martha's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. "We'll handle her if she becomes a problem. Can't afford witnesses this close to the big shipment." A floorboard creaked directly overhead, and dust drifted down through the ceiling boards. Someone was walking toward the stairs, getting ready to come down and check the lower level. The dog tugged at Martha's skirt, leading her toward what looked like solid floor. But when she knelt and examined it closely, she found a hidden trapdoor, another secret, another way these monsters had prepared for their evil work. As the footsteps on the stairs grew louder, Martha lifted the trapdoor to reveal a tunnel that had been carved out of the earth beneath the cabin. Crude, but functional, like something desperate people might dig while trying to escape. The dog disappeared into the tunnel without hesitation. Martha took one last look at the evidence around her. Evidence she couldn't carry. Evidence that might disappear if these men knew someone had discovered their secrets. Above her, a man's voice called out, "Someone's been down here. Look at these footprints." Martha dropped into the tunnel and pulled the trapdoor closed over her head just as heavy boots started down the basement stairs. In the darkness of that earthen tunnel, crawling through dirt that previous victims had clawed with their fingernails in desperate hope of freedom, Martha understood the true scope of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just about Sarah Mills or Emma Wright or any single missing girl. This was about a system, a business, and she was the only person who knew the truth. The tunnel emerged behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the cabin, concealed by winter-dead brush and the natural contours of the land. Martha crawled out gasping, her dress torn and muddy, the dog beside her with dirt clinging to his matted fur. They huddled together in the cold, listening to the voices that carried from the cabin. 2 men, maybe 3, searching the basement and arguing about who might have been there. "Probably just some damn animal," one voice growled. "But we can't take chances. Not this close to moving the merchandise." Merchandise? Martha's stomach churned at hearing human beings described that way. The dog pressed against her side, seeking warmth and offering comfort in return. She realized she'd been thinking of him as just an animal, but his behavior suggested something much more. The way he'd led her directly to this place, bypassing all the other abandoned buildings. The way he'd known about the hidden spaces and escape routes. "You've been here before, haven't you, boy?" Martha whispered, stroking his tangled fur. "This isn't the first time you've tried to show someone the truth." The dog looked up at her with eyes that held too much understanding for a simple stray. There was recognition there, and grief, and something that looked almost like hope. "I'm going to call you Scout," Martha said quietly. "Because that's what you are, isn't it? Scouting for help, trying to find someone who'd listen." Scout's tail moved slightly at the name, and Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years: partnership. She wasn't alone anymore. They waited until the voices faded and the cabin fell silent before making their careful way back toward town. But Martha's mind was racing ahead, trying to figure out what to do with what she'd learned. Who could she tell? The town sheriff was a drunk who barely bothered with ordinary crimes, let alone something like this. The federal marshal was 3 days' ride away, and who would believe the word of a widow woman everyone considered touched in the head? As they walked, Scout led her to one more stop, a small clearing where someone had built a cairn of stones. Beneath the rocks, Martha found more evidence that made her heart ache: a child's hair ribbon, a woman's wedding ring, a locket made of silver, tarnished but still beautiful. Martha picked up the locket with trembling fingers. She knew this piece. She'd admired it many times when she'd seen it around the neck of Rebecca McKenna, Jack's wife. Rebecca, who died of consumption in her bed 2 years ago, according to the doctor and everyone in town. But if Rebecca's locket was here, in this place of secrets and horror, then maybe her death hadn't been as natural as everyone believed. "Oh, Scout," Martha breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "It's been going on longer than I thought." "Much longer." Scout whined softly and pawed at the ground near the cairn. When Martha looked closer, she found scratch marks in the earth, letters carved with a stick or a fingernail. E.W. were the clearest, but she could make out other initials too, R.M., M.C.O., B.S., Emma Wright, Rebecca McKenna, Mary Catherine Odell, Becky Sullivan. 4 women, at least. 4 women whose disappearances or deaths had been explained away with comfortable lies, while the truth lay buried in this lonely clearing. Martha carefully returned everything to its place except for Rebecca's locket. That she slipped into her pocket along with Emma's letter fragment. Evidence. Proof that the respected people of Copper Creek were either blind to the evil in their midst or actively helping to cover it up. As they approached the edge of town, Scout suddenly stiffened and growled low in his throat. Martha followed his gaze and saw them, 3 riders, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, moving toward the forest they'd just left. The lead rider was unmistakable even from a distance. Banker Clayton Morse, one of the most respected men in Copper Creek, riding toward that cabin of horrors like he had every right to be there. Martha's blood ran cold as she recognized the second rider, too. Bull Patterson, the railroad foreman who'd been in town for weeks, supposedly negotiating contracts for the spring cattle drives. The third man was a stranger, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence. Scout pressed against Martha's legs, urging her to move. They needed to get home, needed to think, needed to figure out how to fight monsters who wore the faces of respectable men. But as Martha hurried toward her cabin with Scout at her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that their careful investigation had been noticed. That even now eyes were watching her from windows and doorways, calculating how much she knew and what they'd have to do to keep her quiet. The worst part was the growing certainty that she couldn't trust anyone in town with the truth. Anyone at all. Except for this brave, scarred dog who'd risked everything to find someone who would finally listen. As they reached her cabin, Martha made Scout a promise. "We're going to save those girls, boy. Whatever it takes, we're going to stop these monsters." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she was already too late. Martha spent a sleepless night pacing her cabin floor while Scout kept watch by the window. Every sound made her jump, the wind rattling the shutters, branches scraping against the roof, the normal creaks and sighs of a building settling in the cold. But underneath her fear lay something stronger, a burning need to act before another girl disappeared. At first light, she decided to approach Dr. Harrison. If anyone in town might listen to reason, it would be him. He'd always been kind to her, never treated her like she was addled or peculiar. Surely a man of medicine would understand the urgency of what she'd discovered. But when Martha knocked on his office door, with Rebecca McKenna's locket in her palm and Emma's letter clutched in her other hand, Dr. Harrison barely glanced at her evidence. "Now, Martha," he said gently, like he was talking to a child, "you know, grief can make us see patterns that aren't there. Rebecca died of consumption. I treated her myself. And these young women who've left town, well, that's their choice to make. But, doctor, if you'd just look—" "What you need is rest," he interrupted, already turning away. "Perhaps some of these tonics for your nerves. A woman living alone, dealing with loss, sometimes the mind plays tricks." Martha left his office feeling more isolated than ever. Even the one person she'd trusted to be rational had dismissed her without really listening. The church ladies were worse. At their weekly meeting, when Martha tried to explain about the cabin and the evidence, they exchanged meaningful glances and spoke in the patient tones reserved for the mentally unstable. "Poor dear," said Mrs. Patterson. Bull Patterson's wife, Martha realized with a chill. Living alone has clearly affected her mind. Perhaps we should speak to her pastor about having her evaluated. Martha noticed something that made her skin crawl. the way the women organized their meeting, like they were accustomed to keeping secrets, the way they looked at each other when certain subjects came up, the way Mrs. Patterson subtly guided the conversation away from any mention of missing girls. It was then that Martha understood. Some of them knew. Maybe not the details, but they knew something was wrong and had chosen to look the other way. By afternoon, Martha felt the weight of the town's willful blindness pressing down on her like a physical thing. Even Sarah Mill's own parents had turned her away, insisting their daughter was simply recovering from a fever and didn't need any interference from well-meaning but confused neighbors. As Martha walked home through the gathering dusk, Scout pressed close to her side, sensing her despair. They'd made it almost to her cabin when Scout suddenly stopped dead, his hackles rising. 3 men stepped out of the shadows, Banker Morse, Bull Patterson, and the stranger from yesterday. They moved with the easy confidence of people who'd done this before. "Mrs. Henley," Banker Morse said pleasantly, tipping his hat. "Beautiful evening for a walk, isn't it? Though perhaps a lady shouldn't be wandering around alone after dark. Dangerous things can happen to people who go places they shouldn't." Martha's mouth went dry, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Good evening, Mr. Morse. I was just heading home." "Of course you were. But first, we thought we might have a friendly conversation about your activities today. Seems you've been asking a lot of questions, worrying people unnecessarily." Scout growled low in his throat, and Martha saw Bull Patterson's hand move toward the gun on his hip. "That's a dangerous animal you've got there," Patterson said. "Looks like it might be rabid. Could be we'd be doing the town a service by putting it down." "He's just protective," Martha said quickly. "No harm in that." Banker Morse smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Mrs. Henley, I'm going to speak plainly. You're a woman who's suffered losses, and sometimes grief can make us imagine things that aren't there. But when those imaginings start to upset the peace of our community, well, that becomes everyone's problem." The threat in his words was clear as daylight. Martha felt Scout tense beside her, ready to fight despite the odds. "I understand you found some items today," Morse continued. "Items that don't belong to you. It would be best for everyone if those items were returned to their proper place." Martha's hand instinctively went to her pocket where Rebecca's locket lay hidden. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. The thing is, Mrs. Henley, accidents happen to people who interfere in business that doesn't concern them. Your husband's mining accident, for instance, very tragic, very sudden. Would hate to see history repeat itself." Martha's blood turned to ice. They were talking about Thomas, about his death that everyone said was an accident but had never made sense to her. The mine shaft had been properly shored, the equipment checked. Thomas was too careful, too experienced to make the kind of mistake that would bring the ceiling down on him, unless someone had wanted him dead. "I think I'll be going home now," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excellent idea. And Mrs. Henley, tomorrow there's a church social to celebrate young Sarah Mill's recovery. She'll be well enough to attend, and then she'll be traveling east to stay with relatives permanently. It would be unfortunate if anything disrupted those plans." As the 3 men melted back into the shadows, Martha hurried home with Scout at her side. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched from every dark window and doorway. Inside her cabin, she bolted the door and lit every lamp she owned. In the bright light, she examined Rebecca's locket more carefully and made a discovery that changed everything. Engraved inside the locket was a date, not Rebecca's wedding date or any anniversary Martha knew about. This date was from just 3 days before Rebecca's supposed death from consumption, and engraved beneath it, in tiny letters, were the words, "The truth will set you free." Rebecca had known. Somehow, she'd discovered what was happening to the missing girls, and she'd tried to leave evidence behind. Evidence that someone, her own husband perhaps, had never bothered to look for because the comfortable lie was so much easier to believe. Martha looked down at Scout, who was staring at her with those too intelligent eyes. She was trying to tell people, wasn't she, boy? Just like you've been trying, but nobody wanted to listen. Scout whined softly and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness with alert tension. That's when Martha noticed the shadows moving past her windows, men with lanterns, searching, getting closer. She blew out the lamps and crept to the window. At least 6 men surrounded her cabin, led by Bull Patterson. They weren't bothering to hide their presence anymore. The game had changed. Martha was no longer just a curious widow poking into things she shouldn't. She was a witness who needed to be silenced. As the men began to close in on her cabin, Martha made a desperate decision. She couldn't fight them, couldn't outrun them, but she might be able to outsmart them. She grabbed her heaviest coat and Rebecca's locket, then led Scout to the small root cellar beneath her kitchen floor. If they were going to take her, they'd have to find her first. But as she pulled the cellar door closed over their heads, she heard Bull Patterson's voice carried on the night wind. "Find the dog, too. Can't leave any witnesses." In the darkness beneath her own home, Martha finally understood the full scope of what she was fighting. This wasn't just about saving Sarah Mills or getting justice for the dead girls. This was about survival. Martha and Scout huddled in the root cellar through the longest night of her life, listening to boots stomp across her floor above and rough voices searching every corner of her home. They found nothing, but that didn't stop them from leaving her cabin in shambles. Overturned furniture, broken dishes, and a clear message that nowhere was safe. When dawn finally broke and the searchers had given up, Martha emerged to find her neighbors going about their morning routines as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Kellerman was hanging laundry. Mr. Patterson was feeding his chickens. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm from Jack McKenna's shop. Not one of them met her eyes or asked about the obvious signs of destruction around her cabin. Martha tried once more to reach someone, anyone, who might listen. She approached Mrs. Patterson directly, thinking maybe one woman might understand another's fears. "I know you heard the commotion last night," Martha said quietly, as they stood by the town well. "I know you saw those men searching my place." Mrs. Patterson's face remained carefully blank. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Martha. Perhaps you had too much to drink and knocked some things over yourself. It happens to women living alone sometimes." The casual cruelty of the lie took Martha's breath away. She looked around the small crowd gathered at the well, women she'd known for years, men who'd worked alongside her husband, families she'd brought soup to when they were sick. Every single one of them looked right through her as if she didn't exist. That's when Martha realized the full scope of the conspiracy. It wasn't just the men who ran the trafficking operation. It was the entire community's willingness to sacrifice their most vulnerable members for the comfort of not having to confront uncomfortable truths. The church social that evening was the cruelest mockery of all. The whole town gathered to celebrate Sarah Mills' recovery and to wish her well on her journey east to visit relatives. Sarah herself sat pale and glassy-eyed in a chair of honor, saying nothing, while the adults around her spoke for her. Martha watched from the back of the room as Banker Morse made a toast to the bright future that awaits our young people when they're brave enough to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Bull Patterson stood near Sarah's chair like a guard, his hand resting casually on the back of her seat. But Martha could see the way his fingers gripped just tight enough to remind the girl what would happen if she tried to speak out of turn. "Such a blessing when our young women are mature enough to make these difficult decisions," said Mrs. Patterson, smiling at her husband with the practiced ease of long complicity. "Sarah's parents are so proud of her independence." Martha looked at Sarah's parents, her father staring at his hands, her mother with tears she kept wiping away and attributing to joy at her daughter's opportunities. Neither of them looked proud. They looked broken. That's when Martha understood the mechanism of it all. Fear and shame kept the families quiet. Social pressure kept the community from asking questions. And the constant stream of young women seeking better lives elsewhere had become so normal that no one bothered to wonder why none of them ever wrote home or visited. As the evening wore on, Martha noticed something else that chilled her blood. The church ladies weren't just passive participants in the lies. They were actively organizing them, coordinating their stories, making sure everyone knew the proper way to talk about each disappearance. These women knew, maybe not all the details, but they understood that something terrible was happening, and they'd chosen to be part of the cover-up rather than risk the social disruption that would come with truth-telling. Martha slipped out of the church hall and found Scout waiting for her in the shadows. They walked home through streets that felt more dangerous than the wilderness, past windows that glowed with warm light but offered no sanctuary. At her cabin, Martha discovered fresh evidence of how closely she was being watched. Someone had been through her belongings again while she was at the church. Her few precious possessions, Thomas's wedding ring, her mother's Bible, the small bag of coins she kept for emergencies, had all been moved slightly from their usual places. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere, anytime. That night, as Martha sat by her rebuilt fire with Scout pressed against her side, she finally accepted the truth she'd been avoiding. She was completely alone in this fight. The entire town had made its choice, and that choice was to sacrifice its most vulnerable members to maintain the comfort and prosperity of the rest. But as she looked down at Scout, this brave animal who'd risked everything to find someone who would listen, Martha felt her despair transform into something harder and more determined. If the town wouldn't help her save Sarah Mills and the other missing girls, then she'd have to find another way. And if that meant going up against Banker Morse and Bull Patterson and their network of complicit neighbors, then so be it. She had nothing left to lose anyway. Martha pulled Rebecca's locket from her pocket and studied the engraving again. "The truth will set you free." "Tomorrow, Scout," she whispered to her only ally. "Tomorrow we make our stand." Outside her window, shadows moved through the darkness, and Martha knew she was being watched. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't afraid. She was angry. And anger, she was beginning to understand, might be the most powerful weapon she had. Martha woke to find Scout gone from her cabin and muddy boot prints across her clean floor. A note, written in crude letters, lay on her kitchen table. "The dog is safe as long as you stay quiet. Interfere with tonight's business, and you'll never see him again." For a moment, the loss threatened to break her entirely. Scout had been her only companion in this fight, her proof that someone, even if just an animal, believed in the truth she was trying to tell. But then Martha remembered Rebecca's locket and the message engraved inside it. If Rebecca had tried to fight this evil, maybe she'd left more than just jewelry behind. Maybe she'd found allies Martha didn't know about. There was only one way to find out. Martha wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked through the morning cold to Jack McKenna's blacksmith shop. She found him exactly where she'd expected, hunched over his anvil, pounding hot iron with methodical fury that spoke of a man trying to beat his demons into submission. The forge burned bright in the dim interior, and the rhythm of his hammer was like a heartbeat keeping time with Martha's desperation. "Jack," she called over the noise, "I need to talk to you." He looked up, and Martha was struck by how much he'd aged in the 2 years since Rebecca's death. Lines of grief had carved themselves deep around his eyes, and his shoulders carried the weight of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "Morning, Martha. What brings you by?" Martha pulled Rebecca's locket from her pocket and held it out to him. "I found this. I think your wife was trying to tell you something before she died." Jack's hammer slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He stared at the locket like it was a ghost materialized from his deepest regrets. "Where did you find this?" "In a place Rebecca should never have been. Jack, I need you to listen to me. Really listen, because I think your wife died trying to save other women's lives." For the next hour, Martha told Jack everything: the cabin, the evidence, Scout's desperate attempts to get help, the systematic way the town had been covering up disappearances for years. And as she talked, she watched Jack's face transform from disbelief to horror, to a rage that burned hotter than his forge. "She kept trying to tell me something those last few days," he whispered, his voice hoarse with grief. "Kept saying she was scared, that something wasn't right. But Doc Harrison said it was just the fever talking, and I believed him because it was easier than facing—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Martha understood. It had been easier to believe the comfortable lie than to confront the possibility that Rebecca had discovered something worth killing her for. "Doc Harrison," Jack's voice turned hard. "He was the one who said she died of consumption. He was the one who insisted she be buried quickly before anyone else could see the body." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You think he was part of it?" "I think," Jack said slowly, "it's time we paid Dr. Harrison a visit." They found the doctor in his office, organizing medical supplies with hands that shook slightly when he saw them coming. Martha watched his face carefully as Jack set Rebecca's locket on the examination table. "Tell me about my wife's death," Jack said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that Martha had never heard before. "Tell me the truth this time." Dr. Harrison's composure cracked like ice in spring. "Jack, you have to understand. They threatened my family, my grandchildren. They said if I didn't cooperate." The confession poured out of him like infection from a lanced wound. Rebecca had come to him with evidence about the missing girls, medical evidence that some of them had been injured before they disappeared. She'd begged him to help her contact federal authorities. "But Morse found out," Harrison whispered. "He had men watching all of us, listening to conversations. When Rebecca wouldn't stay quiet, they made her tea with foxglove, made it look like her heart just gave out." Martha felt sick. Foxglove, digitalis, would cause exactly the symptoms Harrison had described as consumption: difficulty breathing, weakness, heart palpitations, and it would be almost impossible to detect after death. "I've been documenting everything since then," Harrison continued, pulling a leather journal from his desk drawer. "Every suspicious death, every girl who disappeared, every time Morse or Patterson pressured me to keep quiet. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to stand with me, someone who couldn't be threatened into silence." Jack's hands clenched into fists. "You let me believe she died of natural causes. You let me think I failed to save her from a disease when she was actually murdered. Because if you'd known the truth, they would have killed you too. Just like they killed Thomas Henley when he started asking too many questions about the mining operation they were using to transport girls. Martha's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Thomas? Your husband was getting too close to the truth about how they were moving the merchandise. That mining accident wasn't an accident, Martha. I'm sorry. The room spun around Martha as 2 years of grief and confusion suddenly made terrible sense. Thomas hadn't died because of carelessness or bad luck. He'd died because he'd been trying to protect other people's daughters. How many? Jack's voice was barely human now. How many women have they taken? Harrison's journal told the story in clinical detail. At least 15 women over 3 years, ranging in age from 16 to 25, all described as seeking better opportunities elsewhere or dying of sudden illnesses that left no trace. Tonight, Harrison said, they're moving Sarah Mills and 3 others to a railroad depot 50 miles north. From there, they'll disappear forever into mining camps and cattle towns where no one asks questions about where women come from. Martha looked at Jack, seeing her own desperate determination reflected in his eyes. We have to stop them. Against Morse and Patterson and their hired men, it's suicide. Maybe, Jack said grimly, but Rebecca and Thomas died trying to save these girls. If we don't act tonight, we'll be complicit in everything that happens after. Harrison closed his journal and stood up straighter than Martha had seen him stand in years. Then we'd better make a plan. Because if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. As they huddled around Harrison's desk, making desperate preparations, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Hope. Not the naive hope that someone else would fix everything, but the hard-earned hope that comes from finding people willing to stand with you against impossible odds. They had until nightfall to save 4 women's lives and expose a conspiracy that had corrupted their entire community. It would have to be enough. But as they planned their desperate mission, none of them noticed the shadow that passed by Harrison's window, or the boots that carried news of their meeting back to the very men they were planning to fight. Martha barely had time to register the sound of horses before Jack's shop door burst open and armed men poured inside. Bull Patterson led them, his face twisted into a smile that held no warmth. Well, well. Looks like we've got ourselves a conspiracy meeting. Jack reached for his hammer, but 3 gun barrels swung toward him before he could lift it. Dr. Harrison raised his hand slowly, his medical journal clutched against his chest like armor that wouldn't stop bullets. Mr. Morse would like a word with all of you, Patterson announced, right now. And don't even think about trying to run. We've got men surrounding this place. They were marched through the empty streets toward the bank, Martha's mind racing with desperate calculations. The town church social had ended hours ago, sending everyone home to their warm fires and comfortable beds. No witnesses, no one to see 3 of their neighbors being forced at gunpoint toward whatever fate awaited them. The bank after hours felt like a tomb. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the familiar space that should have represented security and community trust now revealed its true nature, a fortress where predators counted their profits. Banker Morse sat behind his mahogany desk like a king holding court, ledgers and maps spread before him showing the full scope of his operation. Railroad routes, mining camps, cattle towns, dozens of destinations where young women could disappear without questions. Please, sit down, Morse said pleasantly, as if this were a social call. I'm afraid we have some business to discuss. Martha found herself in a chair facing the desk, Jack on one side and Dr. Harrison on the other. Behind them, Patterson's men blocked any hope of escape. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience," Morse continued. 3 years of careful work, building relationships, establishing trust with suppliers and customers. And now you threaten to destroy it all over what? Sentiment. Misguided moral outrage? "Over murder," Jack said flatly. "Over my wife's life, and Martha's husband's life, and God knows how many others." Morse waved dismissively. "Business casualties, the cost of maintaining a profitable enterprise. Do you have any idea how much money flows through this operation? How many important people depend on our services?" He gestured to a map marked with red pins. Mining camps from Colorado to Montana, cattle ranches across 3 territories, railroad construction crews working in the middle of nowhere. These men need companionship, and they're willing to pay well for it. We simply meet market demand. Martha felt sick, listening to him reduce human suffering to economics. "Those are people's daughters, their sisters, their property," Morse interrupted. "Let's be honest about what women are in this world, Mrs. Henley. Commodities to be traded from fathers to husbands to whoever else can afford them. We simply cut out the middleman." "Where are they?" Dr. Harrison demanded. "Where are Sarah Mills and the others?" Morse smiled and checked his pocket watch. "By now, loading onto a cattle car bound for the copper mines in Montana. They'll have good lives there, fed regularly, housed properly, kept healthy for their work, better than they'd have had married to some dirt farmer in Colorado." Jack lunged forward, but gun barrels pressed against his skull stopped him cold. "Now as for you 3, Morse continued, "you present me with a problem. Dr. Harrison's cooperation has been valuable, but his conscience seems to have overcome his common sense. Mr. McKenna has outlived his usefulness since he stopped being a grieving widower and started asking inconvenient questions. And Mrs. Henley—" He studied Martha with eyes that held no more warmth than a snake's. "You've been nothing but trouble from the beginning. That persistent curiosity, that refusal to accept simple explanations, very inconvenient traits in a woman." Martha's throat felt dry as dust. "What are you going to do with us?" "Well, that depends. Dr. Harrison, you're going to write death certificates for all 3 of you. Natural causes. Heart failure seems appropriate for the stress you've been under. Then you're going to take a dose of your own medicine. Something peaceful, befitting a man of your profession." Harrison's face went white, but his voice stayed steady. "And if I refuse? Then we'll make this much less pleasant for everyone involved. Your choice." Martha looked around the room, searching for any possibility of escape or rescue. That's when she noticed something that made her heart leap. A familiar scratching sound coming from somewhere below them. "Of course," Morse was saying, "we'll need to stage the scene properly." A tragic confrontation between the grieving widower and the doctor he blamed for his wife's death, with poor Mrs. Henley caught in the crossfire. The town will mourn your loss and move on, as they always do. The scratching grew louder, and Martha realized it was coming from beneath the floor. The bank had a basement. She'd seen the stairs during community meetings held here. And if Scout was down there— "You'll never get away with this," Jack said. "People will ask questions." Patterson laughed. "What people?" "Your neighbors have been ignoring questions about missing women for 3 years. You think they'll suddenly grow spines over 3 more deaths?" He had a point that cut Martha to the bone. The same community willingness to look the other way that had protected the trafficking operation would also protect them from any consequences of murder. "Besides," Morse added, "we'll be relocating the operation after this. Too much attention here now. Time to find a new base of operations, a fresh community of good people who mind their own business." The scratching beneath the floor intensified, accompanied now by what sounded like whimpering. Martha caught Dr. Harrison's eye and saw him glance downward, understanding dawning on his face. But it was Jack who acted first. Years of working with hot metal had given him quick reflexes, and grief had given him nothing left to lose. When he suddenly dove forward toward Morse's desk, shouting at the top of his lungs, the chaos that followed saved all their lives. Gunshots boomed in the enclosed space. Glass shattered. Men shouted orders and curses as they tried to grab their suddenly mobile prisoners, and from the basement came the sound Martha had been hoping for. Scouts' fierce barking, joined by human voices shouting for help. The captive women were alive, and they weren't staying quiet anymore. "The basement!" Patterson roared. "Check the basement!" But as his men rushed toward the stairs, Martha heard something that filled her with desperate hope. More voices outside the bank, growing closer. Adult voices, including women's voices, calling out in alarm. The gunshots had been heard. Help was coming. The question was whether it would arrive in time. The basement door exploded open as Scout burst through it, followed by 4 terrified young women in torn dresses. Sarah Mills led them, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes blazing with determination that reminded Martha of her own mother's fierce spirit. "Help us!" Sarah screamed. "They've been keeping us prisoner. They were going to—" Bull Patterson's gun swung toward the girl, but Jack McKenna's blacksmith hammer caught him in the shoulder before he could fire. The impact sent Patterson spinning into a wall, his weapon clattering across the floor. Chaos erupted in the confined space. Dr. Harrison dove behind his chair as bullets flew. Martha scrambled toward the basement stairs, where Scout was herding the rescued women to safety, but Banker Morse still had cards to play. Even as his carefully ordered world collapsed around him, he pulled a small derringer from his desk drawer and aimed it not at the men fighting his guards, but at Sarah Mills. "Everyone stop, or the girl dies, right now." The room went silent except for the sound of harsh breathing and Scout's low growling. Through the bank's front windows, Martha could see torches and lanterns gathering outside, the entire town, awakened by gunshots and drawn by screams for help. "You're going to let us walk out of here," Morse said calmly. "All of us. And you're going to forget everything you've seen tonight, because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows about Dr. Harrison's little morphine habit and Jack's drinking problem and Martha's unfortunate mental condition." Even faced with exposure and ruin, he was still counting on the town's willingness to accept comfortable lies over difficult truths. That's when the most unexpected voice cut through the standoff. "That's enough, Clayton." The bank's front door opened to reveal Mrs. Patterson, Bull's own wife, leading a group of church ladies into the chaos. Behind them came half the town, faces grim in the lamplight. "Emily?" Bull Patterson stared at his wife in disbelief, blood running down his arm from Jack's hammer blow. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done years ago," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "Sarah Mills is my friend's daughter. Emma Wright was like a granddaughter to me. I won't stand by and let you hurt any more children." Martha watched in amazement as more women stepped forward, wives, mothers, sisters of the very men who'd been enforcing the conspiracy of silence, the minister's wife, the mayor's daughter. Even Mrs. Morse, her face pale but resolute. "We know," said Mrs. Kellerman, Martha's neighbor, who'd ignored her destroyed cabin just that morning. "We've known for months what was happening. We were just too scared to act." But when we heard Martha Henley standing up to you," added the minister's wife, "when we saw one woman brave enough to fight for the truth, we realized we had to choose our comfort or our daughters' lives." Banker Morse's face went purple with rage. "You stupid women don't understand what you're doing. This operation brings money into this town, jobs, prosperity. Without it, Copper Creek will dry up and blow away." "Then let it blow away," Martha said quietly, stepping forward despite the gun still pointed at Sarah Mills. "Better an honest ghost town than a prosperous hell." The church ladies moved as one, forming a circle around the armed men with the kind of organized precision they usually reserved for quilting bees and charity drives. No weapons except their moral authority, but it proved more powerful than bullets. Bull Patterson looked around at the wall of disapproving faces and slowly lowered his gun. His hired men followed suit, recognizing defeat when they saw it. But Banker Morse wasn't finished. With the snarl of a cornered animal, he grabbed a kerosene lamp from his desk and smashed it against the wall. Flames spread quickly across the oil-soaked wood paneling. "If I can't have my business, nobody gets anything," he screamed, pulling Sarah Mills toward the back of the burning building. The bank filled with smoke as people rushed for the exits, but Martha didn't hesitate. She followed Morse and his hostage deeper into the building, Scout at her side. The smoke was getting thicker, the flames spreading faster than anyone had expected. Martha could barely see through the haze, but Scout's keen nose guided them toward the back office, where Morse had dragged Sarah. "Let her go, Clayton," Martha called through the smoke. "The building's on fire. We all need to get out." "She comes with me." Morse's voice was cracking with panic and rage. "Insurance for safe passage." Martha found them near the rear exit, Morse with his arm around Sarah's throat. The girl's face streaked with tears and soot. The back wall was already burning, trapping them all in a deadly maze of smoke and flame. "Please," Martha said, her voice gentling despite everything. "She's just a child. Let me take her place." For a moment, something almost human flickered in Morse's eyes. But then Scout growled, and the banker swung his derringer toward the dog. "No!" Sarah Mills broke free and threw herself between Scout and the gun just as Morse pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, but the girl's brave action gave Martha the opening she needed. She tackled Morse, sending them both crashing into his burning desk. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them, but Martha had spent 2 years chopping her own firewood and hauling her own water. She was stronger than she looked. By the time Jack and Dr. Harrison fought through the smoke to reach them, Martha had Morse pinned to the floor, while Scout stood guard and Sarah Mills clutched a ledger that would provide all the evidence federal marshals would need. They escaped the burning bank just as the roof began to collapse, emerging into the cold night air where the entire town waited in a circle of torchlight. Martha staggered into the crowd with soot in her lungs and tears on her cheeks, but Sarah Mills was safe, and the truth was finally free. As she watched Banker Morse and Bull Patterson being tied up by men who'd turned against them, Martha felt Scout press against her legs. She looked down to see him gazing up at her with something that looked remarkably like pride. "We did it, boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke. "We actually did it." But the real victory wasn't in catching the criminals. It was in seeing the faces around her. Neighbors who'd ignored her for years now looked at her with respect. Women who dismissed her warnings were comforting the rescued girls with genuine remorse. The community that had chosen willful blindness was finally ready to see. The town of Copper Creek had been given a second chance to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truth. This time, they chose better. 3 days later, Martha woke in Dr. Harrison's office with clean bandages on her burns and Scout curled up beside her cot like a guardian angel. Through the window, she could see federal marshals on horseback, leading a line of prisoners toward the territorial capital where justice waited. Banker Morse rode with his hands tied behind his back, his once immaculate suit torn and stained. Bull Patterson slumped in his saddle, his wounded shoulder proof of Jack McKenna's righteous hammer. Behind them, 3 hired gunmen and 2 members of the town council who'd taken bribes to look the other way faced their own reckoning. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Harrison asked, checking her bandages with the gentle care of a man trying to atone for years of enforced silence. "Like I got trampled by a stampede," Martha admitted. "But alive. We're all alive." "The girls are doing well," Harrison reported. "Sarah Mills especially. That young woman has steel in her spine. She's been helping the marshals understand the full scope of the operation." Martha nodded, remembering the courage Sarah had shown in throwing herself between Scout and Morse's gun. The child had found her voice when it mattered most. "And the others?" "2 of them have families here who are overjoyed to have them back. The 3rd, Emma Wright's cousin from Wyoming. She's decided to stay and help us figure out how to make sure this never happens again." That was the real work ahead of them, Martha knew. Catching the criminals was only the beginning. The harder task was rebuilding a community that had lost its way, creating structures that would protect the vulnerable instead of sacrificing them to comfort and profit. Over the following weeks, Martha watched Copper Creek transform itself with the kind of determined energy usually reserved for barn raisings and harvest time. The women who'd formed that protective circle in the burning bank became the core of a new town council dedicated to transparency and accountability. Mrs. Patterson, now a widow after her husband's arrest, established a safe house in her large home for any woman who needed shelter. The minister's wife organized a letter-writing campaign to warn other communities about traveling predators. Even Martha's skeptical neighbor, Mrs. Kellerman, became the unofficial keeper of town records, documenting every resident's whereabouts to prevent future disappearances. But it was Jack McKenna who surprised Martha most of all. The grieving widower who'd barely spoken to anyone for 2 years became the town's new unofficial sheriff, his blacksmith strength and moral authority making him the natural choice to keep order. "Rebecca would be proud," Martha told him one evening as they sat on her porch, watching Scout chase rabbits in the twilight. "She died trying to save those girls, and now they're safe because of what we did." Jack nodded slowly. "Took me too long to hear what she was trying to tell me. But maybe that's part of healing, learning to listen better to the people we care about." Martha understood. Thomas had tried to tell her something was wrong with the mining operation, but she'd been too focused on practical concerns to pay attention to his worries. Now she found herself listening more carefully to everyone. The shy girl at the general store who mentioned feeling watched, the widow who worried about her teenage daughter, even Scout's alert behavior when strangers came to town. The town council unanimously appointed Martha as Copper Creek's first official deputy constable, a position that came with a badge and the authority to investigate any situation that seemed suspicious. More importantly, it came with the community's promise to listen when she spoke. "Funny," Martha said, pinning the star to her coat for the first time. 2 months ago, you all thought I was touched in the head. Now you want me to protect you." "Maybe," said Mrs. Kellerman, who'd become one of Martha's strongest supporters. "We were the ones who were touched, in our hearts, where we forgot how to care about each other." The new bank, built from the ashes of Morse's corrupt empire, operated on principles of transparency that would have horrified its predecessor. Every loan was discussed openly. Every major decision was subject to community review, and a significant portion of the profits was dedicated to supporting widows, orphans, and anyone else the old system would have considered disposable. But the change that meant the most to Martha was smaller and more personal. On Sunday mornings, when she walked to church with Scout at her side, children waved to her from their families' wagons. Women invited her to join their conversations instead of falling silent when she approached. Men tipped their hats with genuine respect instead of patronizing tolerance. She was no longer the peculiar widow woman who talked to stray animals. She was Martha Henley, the deputy constable who'd risked everything to save their daughters. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Martha stood in the cemetery beside Thomas's grave, telling him about the justice they'd finally achieved. Scout sat beside her, gray now around the muzzle, but still alert to every sound and movement. "You'd have been proud of this town in the end," she told the simple wooden cross that marked her husband's resting place. They found their courage when it counted. As she turned to leave, Martha noticed a new grave marker nearby, a proper stone headstone that read, "Rebecca McKenna, beloved wife, truth-teller, hero." Jack had finally been able to honor his wife properly, and the whole town had contributed to the monument that would ensure her sacrifice was never forgotten. Walking home through streets that felt safe for the first time in years, Martha reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she'd found bloody fabric in the snow. The scared, isolated widow who'd followed a stray dog into the wilderness was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and power. But the most important change was in Scout himself. The desperate, haunted animal who'd spent months trying to get someone to listen had transformed into the confident, peaceful companion sleeping by Martha's fire each night. His long vigil for justice was finally over. "Good boy," Martha whispered, scratching behind his ears as they settled in for the evening. "Good, brave boy. You brought us all home." Outside her window, Copper Creek settled into the kind of peaceful night that only comes when a community has learned to protect its own. And Martha Henley, deputy constable and keeper of inconvenient truths, slept soundly with her faithful companion keeping watch. Justice, it turned out, was the best lullaby of all. Now, friend, I've told you this story not just for the telling, but because it holds truths we all need to hear in times when the world seems to have lost its way. Martha Henley teaches us that the folks society dismisses, the lonely widows, the peculiar ones, the ones who talk to stray animals, they often see what the rest of us are too comfortable or too scared to notice. Sometimes it takes someone who's been overlooked, someone who's got nothing left to lose, to finally stand up and say what needs saying. Every community has its Martha Henleys, and every community has its Scouts, the unlikely messengers trying desperately to get someone to pay attention to truths that make us uncomfortable. The question is, will we listen, or will we find excuses to look the other way because facing the truth might demand we change how we live? Real courage isn't always loud and flashy like in the moving pictures. Sometimes it's as quiet as an older woman following a dog into the wilderness, or a blacksmith finally hearing what his wife was trying to tell him all along. Sometimes it's church ladies forming a circle around evil men, using nothing but moral authority to stop what badges and bullets couldn't touch. But here's what struck me most about Martha's story. It wasn't one person's heroism that saved those girls. It was what happened when that one person's courage gave others permission to find their own. When Martha stood up, it reminded the whole town who they wanted to be instead of who they'd become. The deepest truth in this tale isn't about trafficking or corruption or even frontier justice. It's about the power we each have to refuse comfortable lies, to listen to the outcasts and the strays, to choose difficult truth over easy blindness. Every person, no matter how overlooked, has the power to change everything if they're brave enough to act when action is needed. Scout reminds us that sometimes salvation comes on 4 legs with a wagging tail, guided by the hands of someone the world forgot to value. That's a truth worth remembering when life sends you a messenger you didn't expect, speaking truths you'd rather not hear. Martha and Scout found each other because they recognized something in each other: the refusal to give up, the determination to keep seeking justice even when everyone else had stopped caring. In every town, every family, every heart, there are those who need someone to follow them into the dark places and bring them home. If this old tale has stirred something in your heart, perhaps you'll share it with someone who needs reminding that every person, no matter how dismissed or discarded, has the power to stand up for what's right. And maybe, just maybe, you'll listen a little closer the next time life sends you a scout of your own, trying to lead you toward a truth that needs telling. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing isn't the monsters who wear respectable faces. It's good people who choose to look away when looking might require them to act. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to close your eyes when others find it convenient to be blind. That's a lesson worth remembering, friend, and worth living by.